Thank you for joining us today. My name is Annie and I'm part of the IIHS Word Lab team. Together with the library team, we host public texts every month. It is my pleasure to introduce our guests for today. We have Peggy Mohan, Anvita Abi, and Chinmay Tumbar with us, and they'll be talking about Peggy's book. Peggy Mohan began life in Trinidad, West Indies, and earned a PhD in linguistics from the University of Michigan. She has taught linguistics at Jawaharlal Nehru University and Jamia Millia Islamia, among other centers. She is the author of 3 novels and has contributed to reputed publications such as the Economic and Political Weekly and IIC Quarterly. She has developed educational television programs for children and learned cartoon animation and opera singing. She now teaches music in Vasant Valley School, New Delhi. An advisor to UNESCO on language issues for long, Professor Abi is an eminent linguist and social scientist belonging to a family of writers. She has been a visiting professor in universities across Europe, Australia, and the Americas. She has taught linguistics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, India for 38 years. She has carried out first-hand field research on all the 6 language families of India, extending from the Himalayas to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. An editor and author of 22 books published nationally and internationally, she was the founder director of the Center for Oral and Tribal Literature at Sahitya Academy, New Delhi, and the president of Linguistic Society of India for 2 terms. Professor Abi's work on tribal and other minority languages of South Asia has been exemplary and has bagged several national and international awards, including the Bhasha Samman in 2003, Leverhulme Professorship at the University of London in 2011, Padma Shri in 2013 by the President of India, and the Kenneth Hale Award in 2015 by the Linguistic Society of America for outstanding lifetime contributions to the documentation and description of languages of India. Chinmay, who will be moderating this session, loves to laugh and learn. He's passionate about migration, cities, and history, and is currently a faculty member at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. An alumnus of the London School of Economics and Political Science, the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, Ruia College, Mumbai, and Rishi Valley School, Madnapalli, he has been a faculty member at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad. He was a 2013 Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute, Florence, and the 2018 Alfred D. Chandler Jr. International Visiting Scholar in Business History at Harvard Business School, Boston. His first book, India Moving, A History of Migration, was published in 2018. His latest book, The Age of Pandemics, was published in 2020. Thank you for joining us today, and over to you, Chinmay.
Thanks a lot. This is going to be a wonderful session on a really outstanding book written by Peggy Mohan called Wanderers, Kings, Merchants, The Story of India Through Its Languages. I'm Chinmay. I'm a trained economist, and you might be wondering why you will have an economist moderating a session with 2 distinguished linguists. And at least one reason I can think of is that economics is often a language very few people seem to understand. And so, it's great to be in conversation with linguists. But I've been working on migration for a long time. And when I read Peggy's book, it did seem to me that language and the understanding the evolution of languages in India is actually probably one of the best ways to understand migration patterns in India. And so not surprisingly, a lot of a book, the title itself is, Wanderers, Kings and Merchants, brings out very nicely elements of migration. This session is about an hour long. We're going to be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have open to question and answer. So congratulations first up, Peggy, for writing this wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it. Let me start by asking you basic question of what motivated you to write this book. And when I was reading this book, I also found a lot of recollections of your own career. You mentioned about incidents which take you back to a classroom 30, 40 years ago. So my second question is, what made you write this now? It seems like a culmination of a lot of thoughts that you had, as it seems like a culmination of an adventure that you've had on languages for several decades now. So tell us a bit more of this.
I always thought of this as something that I had to put down on paper before I departed the planet. A large number of topics that seem to be slowly coming together. The issue of Creoles in the Caribbean, languages hybridizing, India, Sanskrit, what on earth was happening. It was not exactly the same. I was determined to write something which brought all these thoughts together. But even as I started to write, I knew that the journey wasn't over because I would discover more as I was writing. And in fact, as it happened, quite a lot of things came as a surprise to me. And I don't mean just the migration, but theoretical things in what kind of mixing was happening in India. And there were many different kinds and repeating patterns. And I wanted to see if I could capture that.
And this idea of writing it right now in your career, could a book like this have been written 30 years back?
Probably not. I might have known quite a lot of things like about Sanskrit and been more current with it at that time. I might have been more involved with Creoles, but a little distance comes as you think over the years and you begin to question a lot of the things that you thought then, and it ripens in a way. Creoles suddenly don't seem to be something that just happened in the Caribbean, but a kind of mixing that could happen just about anywhere. You begin to ask yourself questions about Sanskrit instead of just taking for granted the text that you'd read. Wait, look at this in Kalidas. It's very strange. It looks like modern Hindi. It looks like Marathi. Why is this here? So I began to ask myself things and started seeing leakages into these languages. They were very porous. And the more I looked, the more I saw. And I knew I wanted to do it because also nobody else seemed to be writing in this way, as though language was a work in progress. There was a lot of capturing the way the language was at the present moment, looking at all the languages of India, but to think of them as something that are happening and there's a direction of flow. I wanted to catch that.
And I think you're very well placed because of this Caribbean experience, which you very nicely bring out in the book as well. From time to time, I kept thinking of, for those who don't know, a lot of new languages emerged in the Caribbean world in just the last 500 years. And that's the usual sort of benchmark to understand how new languages can often pop out. I move now to Anvita and ask you, I also understand that, both of you are friends for a long time. What do you learn from this book? Being a linguist yourself, what do you learn from this book and why did you like it?
Well, hello, everyone. I'm happy to see Peggy after a long, long time. Looks like a long time because I've crossed the borders and now I'm in the USA. So, well, I've known Peggy for many years and she has an amazing capability of looking at the standard old things with new eyes and new dimensions. And this book is no exception. The kind of, I would read from what I had also written for the blur of her book, why I like the book, because this is the most fascinating book on historical linguistics I feel ever written. I mean, as Chinmay also said, it's very anecdotal. It runs like a personal diary. It also reads like a novel, but it revolves around the narration of migration, settlement in a new region, intermarriages, and admixture of population leading to genesis of diverse languages and dialects, each borrowing from each other and then further innovating to become independent languages. Peggy weaves her narration so vividly that each character in the play of language evolution and mixed languages appear in front of your eyes on the stage called India. Her findings reinforce the possibility of existence of prehistoric language or groups similar to Austroasiatic, maybe Munda, in the northwest of Asia. I'll concentrate on this a little later when in the question answer session maybe, which were in contact with pre-old Indo-Aryan community. She questions several myths in her book about pigeons and Creoles, and foremost one that I'm sure she's going to speak on, that Nagamese is not a pigeon or even a Creole, but the newest member of the Magadhan language family. That's what she believes. Peggy goes through the maze of settlement of Indo-Aryan exactly a la mode of Sherlock Holmes, finding small pieces of evidences, identifying the root source of inner structures of the present languages and dialects. Her arguments in describing the evolution of Creoles I think, emerge as a silver lining in the scenario of dying languages, because these are the these are the days when we are all the time concerned about how to save the languages. I think this is one of the most lucid books on linguistic diversity that I've read in many years. So naturally, my appreciation is because of that. But to be very specific about how, what does the book tell you about? There are various chapters, 5, 6, I think 6 chapters or so. Peggy can correct me. But the fact is that what comes out very strongly, and for the people who are watching this show, is that she proves beyond doubt that there is no language which is called pure or impure. Especially in the present scenario of the present political situation, I think this is very important to know. The admixtures of various races and communities give rise to mixed languages, responsible for the genesis of modern Indian languages. I mean, this is in a nutshell that I can summarize the book, which homes in. And she definitely, her larger part of the book actually occupies the migration of Indo-Aryan language speakers, that is the Vedic community. They came in waves, as she says, and we have known this. Each wave was constituted of varying types of members, and each immigrant community left a specific imprint. And these imprints, how these imprints are understood, merged, and further internally innovated, are the results that she has discussed in her book. Why Indo-Aryan languages are like Creole? This is the question that grips Peggy often in her book, especially when she encounters the dialects mix of Indo-Aryan languages. Now, the question that emerges from her description of various migrations of Indo-Aryan languages speakers is that, was it an invasion or was it a migration? And I think this can be open to question, because the migration, as we know, and as Peggy also reinforces, constituted of only of one gender. Men came on their shared chariots and horses and occupied the space here. And of course, they married the local woman. So the local women were not the Vedic language speakers. So this can be seen, this kind of migration, as you can call it, can be seen also as an invasion. And this, as I said, can be discussed. The most interesting part of the book, I find, of the whole story is the so-called Aryan community was diglossic, with women speaking Prakrits and men speaking Sanskrit. And this can be seen even in Abhigyan Shakuntalam by Kalidas's other writings also, where women speak in one language and men speak in another language. There are essentially also no composition by women in the Rig Veda, as women were prohibited from learning Sanskrit. So you can see the diglossic situation existed very much in the olden times, when we had men speaking one language and women speaking another one. So she discusses at length, and time and again, she tries to prove that how Indo-Aryan languages were influenced by Dravidian languages. Because when the locals were married to the Vedic community, they were perhaps drawn from the Indo-Aryan, from the Dravidian community, or from the Austrasiatic Munda community. And I think she has given, and to my mind, I think she has given a large, very, very important focus on retroflexion. One of the features of retroflexion. How retroflexion? Because this is one of the hallmarks of the Dravidian languages. Retroflex sounds are produced by curling the tongue and then flapping it down like da, ta, da, da, da. And there is a influence. She quotes the Agni Sutra from the scriptures, where the very first phrase in the Agni Sutra has a retroflex lateral, which is very much common in most of the Dravidian languages. Om Agni Mile, she quotes this, and it is true that This is where there's a proof that the Indo-Aryan or the Vedic people were merging with the Dravidian people. And, to have come across a sound which is part of your poetry, I would see the convergence must have been there. I mean, just a simple contact will not bring in a sound like that. For example, you can see we have been speaking English for so many years, but many of the communities still cannot pronounce Z and J, you see. So one has to have, this only opens a new dimension about the kind of contact that the Vedic people had with the Dravidians. It must have been a very intense contact to have a retroflex lateral into their system.
Actually, Anita, I'm going to just pause there.
Yeah.
This idea of retroflexion, for those who don't know, the ability to say certain sounds, as somebody who has no exposure to linguistics, was very interesting. I remember, in Marathi, to say "l" is seen to be as a unique gift because so many people cannot say "l" and so on. I'm going to move on to this, the actual chapters of the book. We're not going to be able to cover, everything, but I'm going to just read out the chapters in a book. It starts off, it says a tiramisu bear. It's the second chapter is called The Hidden Story of Sanskrit. Then there's a chapter which we're going to talk about briefly. It's called How the Nambudri Brahmins Changed Malayalam. There's a chapter called How the Indo-Aryan Languages Were Born. And there's a chapter called To Urdu and Hindi via Turkey. Then there's Nagamis and the Magadhans. And then the ending chapters is Indian English as an invasive species. Now, because most of this audience has not been really exposed in the formal, idea of linguistics and so on, we're going to start with the language we're speaking in right now, which is English, and which forms, her last chapter. So, Peggy, tell us about this chapter where you call it, on Indian English as an invasive species. Is it possible that English, the language of the elite in India right now, starts dictating itself in the other languages? How do you see this?
It probably did not have to happen earlier. This actually goes into the whole issue of what is a Prakrit, what is a Creole, what is a local language. Indian English came from not the British so much. It wasn't copied from them. It was not copied from the Anglo-Indians, but the Babus who first started working with them, they spoke this language which included all the hot potato, the very Indian sounds all came into it in the way that they came into Sanskrit. And let's see how I can put it, that slowly you got this. I'm having a slight senior moment. I'm very sorry. I've just gotten over COVID, so very often my train of thought gets a little bit confused. But you begin to see that a language which started out as a second language in India got adopted right after independence, when very small children from the elite started learning it in primary school. And it became something of a first language for them, or a shared first language. This was not so before. So you're seeing that first came the British, then came the British teaching English for Babu's purposes. And after they left, the thing really bloomed and became a language of the Indian elite. Now, the Indian elite, of course, is it's more fluent. It's almost like a first language for them. And you're beginning to see that one thing has changed in this world, which is that this does not remain a static situation of apartheid, where the poor are content to remain very different while the rich speak English, and English is the code, the operating system to give you the privileges of an elite person, the best jobs. And so the poor are aware of it. And the kind of society that we have now globally is demanding more connectivity. People who don't even know very good English have to use it on the internet. Their English is improving. And you're suddenly starting to find that the people who gave us the illusion that Indian languages were healthy and being spoken everywhere, these people have begun to learn English. And once you learn English, and you give it the rights to all the important things in your life, all the modern things in your life, it's very hard to find the earlier languages continuing. It becomes an effort of will, or it becomes a hallmark of poverty, and poverty is not acceptable to the poor anymore. So with that happening, you're going to see an invasion, and you find the invasion coming in the form of more people wanting to have English medium schools. You're finding this thing in the North called Hinglish, where the language itself is being infiltrated. And if you ask a lot of people to speak in Hindi, since they say they speak Hindi, you will probably find that more and more English words, phrases, and even sentences, numbers are coming. So you're seeing a process whereby the language moves from being a second language to becoming something of a first language, to infiltrating Hindi itself. And slowly, if that's not an invasion, I don't know really what is, because now...
You see, Peggy, that's okay. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's a kind of a clamor among Indian community to learn English, and that's why you see the so-called English medium schools mushrooming all over the country. However, the kind of English they teach and the quality of English they teach is deplorable. You see, English has been truly a killer language, as they say, because it made inroads into formal educations, distancing us from the oral tradition, which was our centuries-old strong oral tradition, giving rise to linguistic apartheid, because we now have these distinction between those who know English and those who do not. And I remember when I work in my tribal community, among the tribal communities all over India, whether it is in Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh or Andaman, Nicobar, they all say, ma'am, don't teach us Hindi, why don't you teach us English? Because English is considered to be the ladder to so-called economic development. Now, there's a, but we cannot ignore the fact that this is a very minuscule portion of population that had the privilege of education in the first place, and that of English in the second place. But you also in your book, I remember you raised the question of EWS, economically weaker sections children, not only lack the background of English, but also deprived from home language. Now, I think that was a very important point that you raised in your book, and I liked it because it's true, we are getting far, far away from our indigenous languages, and in a way, we are encouraging the language endangerment. Language endangerment.
Amrita, give me a minute. I wouldn't say that we are encouraging it. We give ourselves too much importance as protagonists here. There is an economic system, and that's why I'm glad that Chinmay is here as an economist, that this dictates quite a lot of what people are going to decide, and they would love to perhaps, maybe in their heart of hearts, they want to keep their languages. But it's a very hard thing to deprive your children of the kind of jobs that exist in the modern sector. And maybe they don't think that they're going to be losing their languages, or maybe they're very sanguine about it. And it's only when you've actually lost it, as many of us have, that you're able to turn around and see its value. At the moment, they're fighting to have what we have, validly, I think, because really speaking, they have no power without it.
By bringing the word oral tradition, what I meant that, you see, initially, India had always been bilingual or multilingual, as you know, but it was a complementary bilingualism. What English has brought in is a competitive bilingualism. Now, people want to learn English and want to forget their indigenous languages. And when they want to forget the indigenous languages, they also forget plethora of indigenous information, which was sustaining, life-sustaining aspects, you see. So this is what
point taken. Yeah, Anita, point taken. So, okay, so, you know, I mean, I kind of agree, because I took Sanskrit in college, Peggy, and I wrote my answers in English, right? So this is how invasive the language definitely seemed at that point. Since you raised economics, I should also point out, you know, the European Central Bank, which England is not part of, has English as a common language, only to keep all the countries at a common disadvantage. And I think that's how really English is, you know, can be seen in India, where we have so many languages where English becomes a language which keeps everyone at a common disadvantage. But we move on now and go to Malayalam, a palindrome as we know it in English, but a language which is very fascinating. And you bring this point of the influence of Sanskrit through migration. And I think this is the chapter which really concretely, brings out this element of migration and a change of language. Tell us more about this.
The thing is that it's recent enough, what happened in Kerala, that we can almost put dates to things. And it's nice because it allows us to get a glimpse of what could have happened before. We know that people came in and that for about 4 centuries, they kept their Sanskrit to themselves for their Shrauta rituals. And at some point, probably because of political change, economic change, I'm constantly talking about politics and economics as influencing language. You suddenly find that the same people who once wrote in Sanskrit start writing in Malayalam and lacking certain words for their literary things because they're writing epics, they start taking them out of Sanskrit. What is different in Kerala is they didn't take the Tadbhava words that we got in Hindi, Marathi, Bengali, all of these. They took real Tatsama words. And that is unusual in India. It came via the literary route. And you find what is interesting is that when words come in, so I'm seeing patterns that how did the words come into Malayalam? They came in as additions on top of an existing language. And always these additions tend, at least at first, to be nouns. We miss that. And what I loved about looking at this story, I found the Urdu story in Hyderabad to be the same. That Persian came because of people who knew Persian, wanting to write in this local language, which is still called Hindi, didn't yet call it Urdu. And what did they bring in? Nouns. So here we see the pattern that in Kerala and in Hyderabad, the nouns coming in.
Excuse me, but Tatsam words are in plenty in all the Dravidian languages, Tamil, Telugu.
Later, they came later, but there's a time thing. The Tatsama words came in exactly the 12th century there. Whereas at this time, Tadbhava words were still the ones that were coming in as the languages were repainting themselves from the local Prakrits. That is why, if you look at the kind of words that we tend to have in Hindi, Marathi, Bengali, and all over the Pakistan area, down into Goa, you find that there's a qualitative, there's a difference between that and what you get in Kerala. Kerala is totally, except for a few words that came via Tamil, they have gotten Tatsama words because of literature. We didn't get them because of literature in the north. We got them because bit by bit, all these languages, which were very old, and this is something I really think is the most exciting thing about my book, is we cannot trace a lot of the features back to anything but what was there before the Vedic languages, before Sanskrit, and possibly the people of Harappa. So you're seeing a coat of paint of new words coming, like in a English way maybe, on top of something much, much older than Sanskrit. The idea that you have compound verbs, hua and ho gaya, that doesn't exist in Sanskrit. Or the past tense, maine khana khaya, khaya and khana refer to each other, whereas main khati hoon. It has to be feminine because I am feminine, female. But in the past tense, it's not like that. Now, this is very unusual in the world, and it's almost completely restricted to that area where the people who lived in the Harappan region spread. And that's what another exciting thing, people keep talking of language X, that they were Dravidians, they were Mundas, and they were something else. We know very little about the Harappan people. And the best we can find is that in our own selves, in the way we speak nowadays, or Hindi. I had this problem because my family is from slightly east of the Hindi zone. I have a problem with gender in verbs. I have a problem with past tenses doing things that they do in Hindi. This is Harappan. We were Magadhan. So at the risk of sounding as though I'm going very fast, I'm finding that you can deconstruct the whole makeup of the modern North Indian languages as something older, either Munda or Harappan, with a coat of paint on the top. Whereas in Malayalam, it remained Malayalam, except for a number of nouns. So you're seeing patterns in how things go. So somebody had asked me, what is the difference between a Prakrit and a Creole? And she wanted me to explain that. A Creole, to me, is a language where the grammar and to some extent the sounds come from one descent line, and the words, the vocabulary come from another. Whereas in a Prakrit, it's almost exactly the same.
I think as I read your book more and more, I came to the conclusion that what you are describing, Invariant languages, the changed languages or Prakrit, as you just said, also, is not Creole, but more a Koine.
No, that's a different matter. No, let's not get confused. Koines happen after the dialects are there. Koines are when many dialects of Marathi generate a standard because of urbanization, again, an economic issue. Gondi is generating a Koine because the Nakshals want to use it as a language of literature. But Koine is a much later phenomenon. It has to do with literacy and the market and all of that. But what I'm saying Creole because there are features in Hindi, Marathi, those are the ones I know something about, and all Northwest languages going down through Gujarati, Rajasthani dialects into Goa, you're finding features that are not a part of Sanskrit. And when you teach Hindi in schools, you teach Tatpurush, you teach a lot of things about Karaks, and in fact, this is not in Hindi. This is in Sanskrit. So we haven't really exercised our brain to understand that the things that make Hindi difficult for, say, a Bengali to learn, or a South Indian to learn, or a foreigner to learn, are the things that are not in Sanskrit at all. Sanskrit actually is in many ways.
I think that's a very important point you're raising, because this we linguists had been very much concerned about the education system, especially teaching grammars in school. All the Indo-Aryan language grammars, run like a Sanskrit grammars, and they don't incorporate that how different we are from even the alphabets. We still teach the same alphabets which are not used, for example, vocalic riri, which is called re, and so on and so forth. The fact is that we have not yet modernized, and we have not recognized that Hindi did not come from Sanskrit. And those so-called the textbook makers think that these Hindi, Punjabi, Gujarati, all the Indo-Aryan languages are offshoot from Sanskrit, knowing very little that they are actually the modern versions of Prakrit, and they have
no, they're not. No, I have to make this distinction now because somebody specially asked me to do this, that Prakrits are very close to Sanskrit. Prakrits have Karaks. I find that I can understand a lot of the Prakrits, like Ashokan inscriptions, Pali, from what I have studied of Sanskrit. However, the big differences come when you get away from like Magadhan Prakrit, a Prakrit in Gujarat, are quite similar. They're just minor differences, I find. However, you'd never say that Bengali has the same grammar as Gujarati. At that level, something very different has happened.
You see, specifics are definitely different.
Yes.
This brings to another question, which you have not dealt in great detail.
I'm going to veer back because the question started from Kerala. So I'm just going to go back to Kerala and then move on. What I really like, firstly, there are two, very nice incidents you mentioned in the chapter. One is that North Indians could see the epics, when they were on television. These were epics from, the Kerala channels were showing it, and the North Indians could watch it with ease because of this kind of familiarity with the Sanskrit. Right, and so that was a very interesting takeaway from. And the second thing which I really don't like is she points out that today there's a lot of migration to Kerala, from North India. I mean, the Keralites are going all over, but there are a lot of people coming to Kerala as well. And yet we're not seeing a wholesale change of the language happening as yet. And she makes this point that the Sanskrit influence comes precisely because the people who come there, the Nambudri Brahmins, are at a position of power. Yeah. And so I think a critical point out here is that the migration effect of changing languages doesn't just happen with any migration, but
Correct.
with the migration of a certain kind of elite. And I think that's a very central point out there. We move on now to this very big sweep that we have from Sanskrit to Urdu, Hindi. We've talked a little bit about Sanskrit. We've talked about the different kinds. I think an important point that I at least thought that Sanskrit is the mother of all languages. And I think the biggest takeaway from me in this book is that it's clearly a flawed notion, and there are many other things going on.
Father of a few.
A father, yeah. That we're going to come to the gender aspect just in a bit. But this idea of let's move to this idea of Urdu and Hindi, because I think it's a very a lot of people have these big questions about when did Urdu really come about and so on. What is your take on this? That is, when does Hindi really emerge? Because this is now the most spoken language in India. When does Urdu really emerge? And how is this all linked to Sanskrit, if at all?
The word Urdu came up in the year 1780 with one poet. Before that, they used many words for this language, and the most common one they used is Hindi. And this goes back before the ghazals, before all the... let's first remember that people were speaking Persian in the court. They were not speaking Urdu or Hindi, but it was a vernacular. And this vernacular goes so far back that Amir Khusro in the 1200s was able to write some of his dohas in something that you could recognize as almost modern Hindi. So this thing was stable already by then. I wanted to differ with people who nitpick and say that Hindi, Hindustani, Urdu are fundamentally different. They're as different as me in a sari, me in shalwar kameez, me in jeans and a t-shirt. They are very superficial things that are different, but the genes, the skeletal structure, the flesh is the same. So Hindi has not fundamentally changed since the 12th century, when the Central Asians came in and brought their Persian. Interestingly, they brought their Persian and not their Uzbek, which they also spoke, which makes me wonder how many others brought in other languages like the Nambudris and threw them away. Jews in Kerala brought in other languages and threw them away. Now, this is the kind of thing that my COVID is doing to me, but that I'm trying to keep my mind on track. But that basically Hindi was already stable and merely here and there taking on new words. And so the whole trajectory from the time that we see it in written text, and it probably spoken before that, to now is not that different. If you just, you could shift the words, you could put Sanskrit and nothing happened. You could put Persian, nothing happened. It was the same language all this time. And it came up at that magic moment around between the 10th and 12th centuries, when a whole lot of modern Indian languages, even Malayalam separately, something happened in that age. And you as an economist probably could think about it. What was so special about that age that new things came up, regions became important, and all the little dialects that were being spoken all over the place with this new Prakrit words in them, suddenly started generating what Anvita called koines. They started being used for secular writing, like legal documents, like lists, like the kind of things that you would use for commercial work. They came up for commercial reasons. Something was economically happening in India at that time, which generated a slew of languages coming up and saying, to Prakrit, go away. That just go away, you not needed anymore. You belong to an age when we had India as a single landmass. Suddenly the regions are becoming important. So again, the Creole type, and I can't say Creole exactly because Marathi is far from being a Creole. It's a very complex language in terms of its endings and so. Creoles normally don't have all of that. But you suddenly find languages coming up which are markedly different from the Prakrits. The Prakrits were essentially, if you study Sanskrit, you can work on Prakrits. You don't have to go through another course to understand them. You just soon know how to make little substitutions. The minute you get into the Hindi, Marathi, and I'm sorry, I would do on that, or the Bengali, Assamese, or Odia on the other side, you're finding the little people and the way they spoke, their Munda features, their Harappan features, sailing up. And as they move the Prakrit out, we've taken your words, we don't need you anymore. You start finding something very alive, but which we thought was lost.
And just related with that, when does then Devanagari, for example, really formalize? I mean, you point out the 1900 injunction, which is a big, landmark. But just for the sense of our listeners, when does Devanagari really come about?
My professor's probably on here and he might fault me a little on this, but I kind of see it as being around the time of Panini, because Panini used it to create a set theory in the Ashtadhyayi. But the interesting thing is that Panini may have done all this and analyzed the language in a wonderful job. He wrote an algorithm. Can you imagine in that day and age? But it wasn't used much. To this, the epics, even the Ashtadhyayi, you find old Pandits knowing it by heart. They didn't have to refer to writing for these things. And so, in fact, at the time that the British came, they were disturbed to find that in North India, people were writing in Persian script very happily. All people, not just Muslims. Or they were writing in something called Kaithi, and in Maharashtra and Gujarat, Modia, they had their own scripts which were not Devanagari. And Devanagari existed, was not used much, but then the British said they had the power. Now they were the government. They could deploy funds towards schools this way and that. They encouraged Devanagari as a counter to Persian. And whatever that may have done to Persian, it certainly was a death blow to the local languages, like local scripts like Kaithi and Moria and Mahajani, which were up in the north. So suddenly, I learned these as a child because I grew up outside of India. My great-grandfather would teach me how to write in Kaithi. I came to India and people treat me like a fossil that, oh, you actually learned this language as a child. It's gone in India. People who know about it can't lay hands on texts.
But so I'm going to move now to this point about how do we think of migration and language formation? We've talked about the Kerala aspect, but then an important part of your book, and this also comes down to gender, is about the men. I mean, this is an important idea that I got from the book. That is, the men are coming in with a particular language. They are marrying in, and as the families are sort of getting formed, the sons preserve the men's sort of language, and the daughters are typically speaking a different language.
Another ethnic group, yeah.
So just tell us a little bit about that, and then I'm going to go to Anvita and ask also about how do we think of migration, especially in the Andaman context, because Anvita's done a lot of work on that.
Let's see now. You'd asked about the men coming in. It's slightly more complicated than that, because there's also something else, that all male migrants who came into India came with two languages. I'm simplifying it, maybe not all did, but the Central Asians came with Persian and with Uzbek. Uzbek they threw away. Jews came with Hebrew, sacred language, and Ladino, which is a lovely language which has been thrown away. It's the vernaculars. The Nambudris must have had something besides Sanskrit, because nobody comes in the 8th century speaking Sanskrit as their mother tongue. And I ask myself, what was the true story of the Vedic men? Did they also come with two languages, and one which they liked more than the other or respected more than the other? So they had that. Then when you have a family, I think you will notice, not just in India, this is a common thing in a lot of other places, the Caribbean with native Caribs, that when you have a mixed situation like this, where the men have overwhelmed the women and they have children grow up with their mothers for the first 5 years or so. And since they've grown up with their mothers, their first language, their mother tongue is really the other language, the other ethnic language. So now what happens in Sanskrit is that the boys, when they're pulled into learning Sanskrit and possibly writing verses for the Rig Veda, they have to suppress this other language or maybe use it only in much more casual situations, like speaking with their sisters or speaking with other people outside in the community. So you suddenly find boys who know 2 languages, girls who of course don't matter. Out of it, you're ethnically other, but the boys know 2 languages. So suddenly there's one that they use, very Prakriti, increasingly moving away from Sanskrit. And there's the Rigvedic Sanskrit, which they write in. And slowly over a period of hundreds of years, this language that they've been trying to keep very very pristine, this Rigvedic Sanskrit begins to pick up all the dhurna. La, which Anvita mentioned, came much later when the book was taken down into the Deccan. And come to think of it, it just happens that we have written that sound. Everybody pronounces that quite differently from what Panini would approve of. Even in the North, they'd say the Erla as Erna or Erla, but they definitely do not say it in the original way. So something happened over time. And since we're being economic again, because I think language is economics, we found that the time when they agreed that Sanskrit should incorporate these sounds, we're going to formalize it, we're going to make the Samhitas and preserve all these texts, coincided with the time that there was a new empire and ready to expand all over North India. So so the incorporation of Indian sounds, not just into speech, but into the Rig Veda and recitation and saying this is how it is. And we are now fully with Indian retroflex dhurna. Erla was not in the not supposed to be there, but it got in later. Coincided with the start of an empire where the whole thing spread. So you see a tiny little bit of Vedic people moving, then they consolidate, and that's about 700 years after the first appearance of the Rigvedic verses. They go all over, move towards Bengal. Assam came a little later, down, I'm told, into the Andhra area, definitely Maharashtra, and possibly even further south into the Konkan area. And so you basically find that language is coinciding with a lot of economic and political activity, which is consolidating big changes. And then, of course, other changes came later that I talked about.
Yeah, I think very, very perceptive about economics, language, and migration as a model of change. Anvita, you've done fantastic work on the Andaman and Nicobar place. Now, this is an interesting kind of a benchmark to compare some of the stuff that we talk about, because not much of migration in the last, say, 2,000 years has affected it. What would you say are some of the roots, in your research? How do you look at this thing about migration and language formation itself with respect to the work that you did in the Andamans?
Well, the situation of Andaman is very, very different from the rest of the languages that reside in India. Peggy has not taken into account 2 language families in her book, which I must bring it out now, because one is the 5th language family, Tai Kadai, spoken in Arunachal, though she does mention Ahom and the speakers, the Ahom language. And also the 6th language family, Great Andamanis, which had 10 languages in its fold, but now there's only 4 speakers remaining in the entire set of islands.
And you're one of them?
Yeah, only 4, and they also don't speak the language, they are only rememberers. As far as the antiquity of this language family is concerned, the migration took place on this island, and it is proven by geneticists, 70,000 years ago. They are the remnants of the first migrant from Africa. And they came here and settled here, and they had no contact with anybody else outside the island. They were self-sustaining. And if you remember the map of Great Andaman, they occupied from the northernmost tip to the southernmost tip of the Great Andaman Islands, spread out in 10 different regions, speaking 10 different languages. However, only the ones that I have worked on are derived or are constituted of the North Andamanis, who were left alone, and then the government of India put them together in an island called Strait Island, and that's where they are. So their language, because it did not come into contact with any other islanders, nor they allowed any migrants into the community, because all these kind of stories are also popular, though we do not know how far they are correct, that they were very violent, they killed people who stepped on their island. Nonetheless, the fact that now we have in front of us, especially proven by the geneticists, that there had been no contact till the Britishers came and established the penal colony in 1857.
Yeah, and with that, so I think what it tells us is also how a particular language can sustain itself for a very long period in isolation. And I was seeing the World Ethno Atlas, and one of the remarkable statistics from that is that you would think that India is the country with the most number of languages in the world. As per that database, it is Papua New Guinea. And Papua New Guinea, it's all these islands, they've never spoken to each other, and they've just maintained those languages across centuries, which is just remarkable.
No, that's in Papua New Guinea. They are somewhat close by mountainous region, a single island, and they too are
but it has a huge number of islands.
That is that they have a largest number of languages.
Indonesia.
Yeah. All right. So now we're going to have a reading now, and we also got a question in the chat box on Nagamese, which is something that you've covered. So let's have an extract reading from the book on the chapter which says Nagamese and the Magadhans. So when you read and stop a little bit, and then we'll move on to question answers.
Okay, let me see if I can. I thought that this was probably the Northeast and the whole Magadhan area was least likely to be discussed. So I chose my chapter out of that. Before I start, I'll explain what's a tone language. A tone language is one with, like Chinese, with short words where ma, ma, ma all have different meanings. The tone of the word ma, 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 ma. All of these. So I'm going to talk about the tribal languages, which seem to have their tone languages, but the ones that came up were not. They were like what most of mainland India speaks. Punjabi has tones, but they don't know it. Anyway, okay. The languages in the Magadhan family, like the region's terrain and wildlife, are unlike the rest of the Indo-Aryan zone, not merely in terms of detail, the way all dialects set themselves apart, but because significant categories in their makeup are different. Bengali, Oriya, Assamese, and the dialects of Bhojpuri, Magahi, and Maithili of Bihar and Eastern UP, for example, unlike the other Indo-Aryan languages, do not have grammatical gender. In fact, not only do verbs in the Magadhan languages not have gender, they actually behave like verbs in Sanskrit do, with person agreement in all the tenses. On this journey through Nagaland and the Magadhan zone, we started by looking at Nagamese and wondering if this was the Indian pidgin we had been hoping for. Since it is a tone-free, it's not like Naga languages which have tones. It's a tone-free link language for tribes whose native languages are tone languages and not mutually intelligible. Nagas can't understand each other's languages. What we found was something a bit too rich in its form, too close to Assamese, and too distant from Naga languages to be a true pidgin. Here we have what I would call a Prakrit. This is a Prakrit. One could easily say that Nagamese is just the newest member of the Magadhan family and the language that now defines its eastern boundary. Then we scroll back in time to look at Assamese, the local Magadhan language adopted by the Ahom, who had come into Assam as migrants from the east. These were men also. In the beginning, they too had been speakers of a tone language, but they intermarried with local women, keeping their old Ahom language as a restricted language of liturgy and elite male power. The Assamese language, the language that had been there before them, became the glue that united the Brahmaputra Valley, and before Nagamese was born, defined the eastern frontier of the Magadhan family. And then we expanded and deepened our sights to something that happened 4,000 years ago in the past, an encounter between Austroasiatic migrants coming in from Southeast Asia and early Indians, Mundas, who were a separate culture from the Harappans. The geneticists found a familiar pattern of mixture in the present-day Munda population that indicated relationships between Austroasiatic migrant men and local Munda women, creating children who 1 full millennium later would be the ones who met the Arya coming in from the Northwest. This mixed Munda group was probably the local population that did the most of the spade work in making the Magadhan languages. The common feature in all these 3 stories is the arrival of migrants from the East, Southeast Asia, and ultimately South China. These migrants gave a different character, a more Asian character to the Magadhan region. Just one more para. As in the tiramisu bear, these streams of migrant and local languages came together, creating a spectrum of related varieties where earlier there had only been isolated languages and dialects, each in its own small corner. Mixed languages are ultimately about connectivity, about markets and literacy becoming important. They are about a sense of region and government and distances vanishing as people and land come together, leaving the world of small groups and villages far behind to move on to towns and cities and then on to empires on the scale of ancient Magadha. The Magadhan era was a special time, but as we can see from the story of the Ahom and the Nagas, the confluence didn't end. It has only joined a larger stream, the stream of English, that other second language that Nagamese flows into, and not only Nagamese, but all the modern Indian languages too. When tongues converge, it is because of larger forces at work, forces that are not linguistic, but political and economic, and aimed at bringing people together into a single conversation. And as these forces build, they gather speed until it is no longer about the little people and what they want, and no longer about languages converging in concert with genes. At the last turn, we have taken a giant leap away from terra firma to a space that has nothing at all to do with the Indian genome.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Yeah, so unfortunately, since we're hitting the time limit, we're going to quickly move to Q&A. I'll just conclude this conversation by pointing out the fact that I learned a lot while reading this book. As a person who has no formal training in linguistics, the idea of how important the state is. When the state decides the script is so and so, then it can change, and that's probably very important in the current discourse on what languages our kids should be learning. The fact that Sanskrit is not, in a way, the first language of India. There were languages before, and that Sanskrit is, there's a lot of confluence happening. And I think the key message really of this book, as for books coming off, using, so for example, Tony Joseph's book, which looks at the latest work in genetics, is that at the end of the day, this is all really a phenomenon of mixture and hybridity, except for the Andamans, in which case, it's a rare kind of event right now. And as she, pointed out, there are 4 people left. But hopefully, more people pick this up, and hopefully these traditions can be kept. So we're going to move now to questions, and I'm going to read out some of them. Right. So Aishwarya has a question on the decline of Prakrit coincides with the decline of Jainism and Buddhism? Question mark. And then also, is it 12th century? So I think there are 2 things, like how do we see Prakrit, Buddhism, Jainism, and is there something to do with the 12th century on that? Yeah.
Essentially, yes. That's the only thing I can find that seems to sync with it very well, that there were battles in Kerala, battles in other parts of India where Brahmanism asserted itself. Buddhist texts, which we had to study, had to come from outside of India. They were not even in India anymore. So there was something about the 12th century that was a reestablishment of Brahmanism, but yet it didn't bring back Sanskrit in the same way. It brought in local regions. So quite a lot was happening, and I can't go into all of it, and I don't even know all of it. I tried to track it, but one thing that was definitely there is Buddhism being pretty much rooted out at that time. Yes.
Yeah. Anvita, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, she said, just a very brief, we cannot ignore the existence of Pali at this time, because Buddhism, when it came, it also made us learn a different language, because that was a different language and the grammar is different. And it was when you read Pali, I had a course in Pali in my pre-PhD, and I realized that sometimes it appears like a simplified version of Sanskrit, but it is not. So we had a different language to communicate, because Buddhists propagated Pali, and the many scriptures are there even in Ashokan time, of Pali.
Okay,
There's one tiny point, let me add, that
Sure.
when we studied Pali, we were aware that a lot of the texts were retrieved from other countries, not India, put back into Devanagari for us to read. They had originally been in India, but we had to get them back. They had gone.
Okay.
So let me just quickly ask you a question, since you're both linguists. How many languages do you all know? And is there some sort of a magic number linguists ought to know?
That's a terrible question, and I hate answering it because I know them all in very different ways. I'm about to fly to Mexico.
But even to some extent, a very rudimentary.
Chinmay, this is the question each of us face every day. How many languages do you know? And my answer is always the following. Do you ever ask a doctor that how many diseases you have?
Yeah.
You never. He knows how to treat you because he knows about the various diseases. Same is our question. Same is our position. We know a lot about languages, but maybe we speak or understand maybe 4 or 5 languages, not more. I have personally worked on more than 90 languages of India as of now, because I do a lot of field linguistics, but I do not speak them and I do not understand them if they are thrown to me immediately.
And Peggy, how many can you? Is there a number?
I'd say that Anvita essentially got it right. I was happy to decode Chagtai and put it on the cover of my book. I was happy to delve into Malayalam and Mani Pravalam literature, but I couldn't do it without the help of a young man who was a specialist. And it's just that once I'm given the keys, I'm able to click and figure it out. I'm not scared of them. Whenever I travel, I don't mind jumping into Japanese, jumping into Indonesian, and people wonder, but Turkish, I love them, but I don't, you couldn't really say I speak them. But of course, I have French and Spanish. I have Latin. So when I did Sanskrit, it was very easy to make the connections. I'm about to go to Mexico to quarantine to get to see my daughter. And I'm rejuvenating my Spanish in my head because it's as alive as my English, but it's just gone to sleep for some time.
I think one of the things that really, flows through the entire book is precisely your amazing kind of cross-continental experience and exposure, that really filters out really nicely in the book. But I should point out that I'm in the economics profession. And as I like to say, in economics, in India, to be a successful economist, you need to know 3 languages, English, mathematics, and Bengali, because the migration of Bengali economists, all over the world is a really strong part of the profession. There's another question, and there are many questions of the similar genre. And this is a kind of let's say, public policy kind of question. For example, why is Hindi being imposed on, say, Adivasis and so on? I'm sure you guys get these questions all the time, but I think this is a kind of a question, especially with the new insert kind of rules and so on, which I think a lot of the listeners would be interested in. That is, what are your positions on, Peggy first and then Anvita, what is your position on preserving languages at the same time, having a formal education in certain languages?
I don't like the word preserve because you preserve things that are dead. Anything that is alive will look after itself. However, my husband and I very often used to talk about our fields. His was a transport and mine was linguistics. And I found that there was a metaphor that I liked, that you have village roads, a pakdandi, a path. You have unpaved roads, you have the roads that are intercity, you have rail, you have large super highways, roads through towns, you have air travel, and these all have their place. That if a tribal person wants to navigate a system which requires them to go on a national highway, maybe not an expressway, they will have to go to the national highway language. And we have made it that way that there is a whole I wouldn't even call it, they're each steps on because I don't use the word continuum for this, but there are various stages which are quite discrete from each other, so that we've made it so that if a tribal person needs to communicate in the sphere that we're communicating in, he's got to use English. If he needs to go to the local authorities, he might need a local language. People are pushing Hindi. I think I don't need to tell you that there's a certain reason why a certain convergence and connectivity goes together with a new neoliberal and maybe even very communal ideology. They all go very well together. They're pulling India, but they're trying to pull them towards Hindi. But ultimately, they're not. It's not different from the move that's taking us to English or taking the European community towards banking in English.
Anita, very quickly.
Yeah, you see, Chinmay, you said why Hindi is imposed on tribes. Actually, you would be surprised that the Hindi is not imposed on tribes. We conducted a very large survey of entire India through a project funded by Indian Council for Social Sciences and Research about the acceptance level of Hindi across the length and breadth of the country. And we were surprised to see that Hindi is accepted very widely across board, because they think this is the language of communication and gives the mobility to transfer from one state to another, but more so in the northeastern side. And the Northeast, the tribes think this is the language of development and economic benefits, because they think it's easy to get a job if you know a little bit of Hindi. And this is perhaps the reason now Hindi, but you see, they don't like standard Hindi. They like and they accept the non-standard Hindi. So now we have varieties of Hindis emerged in this country. It's an Arunachalis Hindis, Meghalaya Hindis, Assamese, and then you have Bihari Hindi and Jharkhandi Hindi. They're all different from standard Hindi. Now you also have Andamani Hindi.
It's like Indian English.
Yeah, so now we have varieties, and if the government of India somehow recognizes, gives status to these Hindis, Hindi is very popular, and it has nothing has to be done. I mean, this is not because of the government of India; it is because of Amitabh Bachchan and the Bollywood movies that Hindi has become so popular, and everybody understands. And there is no doubt about it, because I have worked in the remotest of the areas of the country. I cannot exist. And I'll go hungry if I did not know just one sentence, mujhe bhook lagi hai, khana chahiye, whatever, you see.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
In any other language, if I speak in Tamil or Telugu or any other language or Marathi, people won't understand me. So it has become an essential aspect of comprehension and
I'm going to take a couple of more questions from the chat box.
Sure.
One is from Marathi, so I'm going to partial to this one. And it says, Sandhya Renukama asks, one more question. As a native Marathi speaker, I've always considered that Marathi has all the sounds possible, except for the her sound. That's her question. And it's very close to the intersecting area of Indo-European, mostly in the north, and Dravidian in the south, if you put it on a Venn diagram. So is her interpretation correct? If yes, why? Basically, I think the question is, what is this uniqueness about Marathi as it sits at this intersection between the Indo-European and the Dravidian languages?
I think that I could put it the simplest visually is that look at the geography of it. That's one. The second is that while we think of India as being 2 or 3 broad zones, the Dravidian zone, the Munda zone, and of course I'm saying now the Northern Harappan zone, these also was fragmented in other ways. So Marathi would have features that were unique. The Maharashtrian zone had, and please remember that Marathi in the dialects is not homogeneous. A lot of things are different from district to district. So you found that people were varied and different from, say, people around the Delhi area, different from people in the Northwest in Sindh and Punjab and so on. But that since they were quite close to the Dravidian region, it's quite possible that a number of the people who made Marathi had earlier antecedents that were closer to the South Indian languages. In fact, Marathi was the first language identified as a hybrid in all this kind of studies. That's what set me off thinking that there might be something there. So I wish I knew more, but every time I looked at something, I found grammatical features that they could be explained by Tamil, whereas you couldn't find them in Hindi. So Marathi is somewhere at a crossroads of North and South.
Yeah, I'll just go quickly through one more question. A person is asking, Peggy, I'm interested, Geeta Basappa is asking, Peggy, I'm interested to know why you chose to examine Malayalam as the example of a South Indian language and not Tamil. And this is, I think, obviously a question because you can't cover all the languages.
No, there's an answer. I would have, because the book is about migration and mixing. And since Tamil has it has a few old tadbhavas from the Sangam era, it's poetry. It didn't have as much as Malayalam. And Malayalam, you can actually see not merely mixture, you could see, I took it because I thought we don't know much about the Vedic men coming into the north of the Indus area, but was this a replay of it? Could we look at Kerala and see a replay of the past with very small details different? We must be aware that they're different. But so I was my initial attraction was that it told us the story of 3,700 years ago in the north, which we couldn't see and we could only guess at. And here we were seeing it in front of us.
One more question. Does Urdu mean, from Angad Nair, does Urdu mean camp? And is it true that Urdu is the result of the language spoken by soldiers stationed in camps?
No, the word Urdu came in the year 1780 by the poet Mushafi, who was from Lucknow. He said, Urdu hamari hai. And it was never used for that before. Urdu is an Uzbek word, which is the same as the Turkish word ordu, which means soldier or army. So ordular, and
so there is some connection.
Yeah. So but it's also like Urdu e Moalla. This kind of idea came from there. I think that the ordular who came in, we don't even use those Turkish expressions anymore. They had this word. But earlier they were not even called that. They were called Ujbuks, if you ever heard, the Uzbeks, and their language kind of vanished. I can think of 5-6 words that actually came from original Central Asia. Urdu is one word that did. So 5-6 of these words, but it doesn't mean camp as such. But there is it also refers to the golden horde, the horde in English, the hurdu, which came from Central Asia. But at some point, it was just applied to the language because it was just one man's fancy, and then it took. But okay.
Great. All right. So I think we've reached the end of the session now, and we have a lot of people still with us after even 80 minutes, which is, I think, a testament to what a conversation on languages probably does in India. When you go outside India, often sometimes you get asked, do you speak Indian? And obviously, that's probably the most obvious question which pains an Indian, saying that how can you even ask this question?
Yeah.
And when I read this book, I must say, I kind of regret that I had not read this 2 years earlier. Of course, the book has just come out because it would have really helped my book and my work, on migration. Because there's just so much in this book which talks about migration and languages and mixture. So it's a fantastic, contribution, and I'm sure that every person who's going to work in this field going forward is going to consult it. Thanks again to everyone who have asked some fantastic questions. I'm sorry you couldn't take all of them. Some questions are of the ream, have you covered this? For those, I'll say, please do read the book, because she has actually covered a lot of languages. But it is, of course, impossible to cover all the languages of India and give due justice to all of them in one slim volume. For example, when I wrote this book on migration, Peggy, I get this question, but why didn't you talk about the Saraswats? And why didn't you talk about this community? Thousands of communities, you can't really condense, all of that.
Tibetans taking on Nepali in the up in Sikkim. I leave something for others to do.
Absolutely. So thanks a lot. All the best, and do take care. So we'll end the session right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being part of the public text session today. And thank you to all those who attended. Please do check out the chat box. We have given you links for the session recording and the form. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Please do find us there for all the updates. And thank you so much.